let's just start with CIBC's projections here. So these are CIBC's projections for where interest rates are going. The Bank of Canada overnight rate, they have them going to 2.25. And I'm not really like picking on CIBC. It seems to be, pretty much just the kind of the consensus of where interest rates are going. But I'm going to explain to the viewers today is like if I was betting on this, and I don't suggest running your personal financial life as betting where you have to win. But if I was betting, I would take the under on that 2.25. And that might be kind of surprising to some people, but I'll explain why I would take the under on that 2.25. So,
okay, so if that's the overnight rate, what can they expect for a mortgage rate?
I mean,
that overnight
sure.
rate?
So your prime rate right now, prime rates are 2.2% over the overnight rate, and so at 2.25, you'd expect a prime rate of 4.45, which really is the historical average last 25 years. So you're going back last 25, last 30 years, like 4.45, is about the average, right? Some people talk about like, oh, it's the neutral rate. It's like, I kind of hate terms like this. It's like a neutral rate. It's like, what does that mean exactly? You know what I mean? Because everyone has different definitions of it, and they're looking at different things. It's like, I'm just going to tell you, it's the average. Like the average is kind of a certain calculation you can just take what the prime rates are and run a simple average formula and figure out
so
what
if you have an adjustable rate mortgage, you're looking at 4.45
minus half, call it, right?
Sure.
Like, sometimes, people who renewed, kind of, 23 or so, maybe they didn't get the best deal on a lot of these variable rate mortgages. Historically, you've seen something up to like prime -1. Don't see those a lot these days, but I would say like prime minus a half is kind of the par for the course, if you will, right?
Sure.
It's kind of ordinary of what sort of deal that you're getting. So at 2.25, they got a prime rate of 4.45, and you got a variable rate mortgage of just under 4%, 3.95%. Right. Okay. That's what CIBC is projecting. Not that drastic of a forecast, really, because like I say, that is the average, right? That is the average for the last 25 years. And I actually think that's knowing those averages and planning your investment life around that, things tend to mean revert. They can do a lot of funny things in the short or even medium term. But ultimately things mean revert to the average. So you don't want to buy a piece of property where it only works if you get a 2% mortgage, because that's not the likely that's going to happen over the, the 25 or 30 years of that, mortgage. Right?
Yeah,
so
for sure.
Okay. So 2.25, what does the Bank of Canada, like, what do they look at? Like generally the criticisms of the central banks around the world is they're looking in the rearview mirror to set these rates. That's generally the criticisms. They're generally looking at CPI. So I like to call it the fake government calculation of inflation, CPI, and they look at employment. Those are the two things, but those tend to be lagging indicators. The CPI and the unemployment have a lot to do with the decisions that were made in the past. They're not really projecting on where it's going. Okay, so you can see now target rate between 1% and 3%. We've been between the target rate all year at this point, and we're under the midline of 2%. We're at 1.6% with the last announcement on October 15th. Okay, so the CIBC, suggesting, or I keep picking on CIBC, but it's not. That's kind of the market consensus there. They're projecting that interest rates are going to fall. You have CPI that's less than the mean rate on the target of 2%. Okay, like pretty obvious, Captain Obvious. This thing is going lower. Okay, but I'm suggesting I don't think they realize that it might go lower than that, and I'll explain why. So 1.6% on the CPI, and then you have employment. So they're looking at the headline unemployment rate, number that I always have a little bit of trouble with, because it inherently has to estimate how many people are actually looking for a job, which is a difficult task. Like that's not easy to estimate. Okay. Generally speaking, anything over 6%, that tends to meet the definition of unemployment. Anything under 6% tends to be, it's like there's just a certain amount of transition expected. You can't have everyone working all the time. People are switching jobs, entering, leaving the workforce. So 100% is kind of a wishful thing. It's not really practical. 6%. And you can start to see when we get over 6% here, that coincided with the, where we started to see rates starting to fall, okay? Where we no longer have full employment, which you would at anything under 6. I like to always look at full-time jobs because I think it's it's a number that's a little more reliable because you either have a full-time job or you don't.
Okay.
You either count it or you don't, as opposed to trying to count someone who hypothetically is looking but doesn't have it versus someone who doesn't have a job but supposedly isn't looking. That's a harder number to count. But full-time jobs is, less, we can't manipulate it as much. And then you have your median hourly wage, okay? Median hourly wage. And we haven't had a lot of wage growth really at all in 2024, like at all. I mean, we're at, $29.88 in January and we're at $30 in September. And so the median
Pretty
wage
flat.
is they're pretty flat. Okay. So it's not like we have a really robust employment market. It's not like we have significant wage inflation. It's like, so that's why, CIBC looking at 2.25. Okay. But the part where central banks, I don't think they look a lot, is they don't look at the leading indicators. Okay. So the leading indicators, you're trying to project where it's going, right? Rather than, just reacting to CPI or reacting to the job market and adjusting rates, which they do because they're, at the end of the day, they're kind of political animals, despite the artificial, separation between them and the politicians. Ultimately, they are ultimately appointed when you go through the process by the elected officials. So, yeah, and I know people in the comments are going to point out the separation, but just go through it. Just go in line of who appoints the finance minister and how the finance minister appoints the committee, how the committee eventually appoints
they don't talk at all. They don't discuss these things, and they have no say in who gets to be the
how the finance minister can ultimately remove the governor, and how the prime minister can ultimately remove the finance minister. Like, it's just like eventually it just comes back to a one head basically. So, so if we're looking at that, the first thing we look on, trying to project is energy prices.
Okay. Energy
prices will change inflation in a hurry. And so they can change inflation, kind of in the short term. Like, I'm talking, 1, 2, 3, 6 months for sure, but like in the short term, 1 to 3 months, an increase in energy prices, the prices of everything will go up, right? Yeah. You just think when you buy something online, it's like that shipping price that you're paying was not the same shipping price that you were paying even last month. Mm-hmm. Like those things get updated in real time, right? It's not like 20 years ago where companies are sitting on warehouses and warehouses of inventory. It's like they have just-in-time inventory systems where they're ordering just what they need in real time, and that's the goal. And so everything is a factor of energy. Nothing gets done without energy. If you have $200 a barrel oil, prices of everything are going up. They're going up, and they're going up in a hurry. Okay, sure. It's not going to be a lag of a year or two, and so you start to see. This is even in a relatively flat market. You start to see. Where you have energy prices coming down here of 86%, and I see this is a simplified, oil, but if you go back in our post, we show you what, how big of a component oil is like that's still where the world gets its energy. And so when you see the price of oil coming down in the green here, you tend to see the CPI rates of these, both Canada and the U.S. also coming down at the same time. And then when it takes a step up, you also seem to see a creep up at roughly the same time. Okay. Now it's not 100%, but you also got to look at the aggregate move, right? If oil goes from $79 to $82 a barrel, it's kind of flat. Like, it's kind of flat, and it's one variable in the equation. But if oil goes, from 72 to, 80, 85, it's like that's where you start to get some increase. So it's
sure.
the percentage move, not just like, is there a move, right? And how long did that price go up for? So keep an eye on the energy markets, because that could change. You know, someone drops a bomb in the wrong place in the world, and all of a sudden you have a whole lot less energy to go around. Those prices skyrocket. Like, you know, all bets are off, right? You know, both CIBC and myself, who's taking the under, could be wrong, right? Because that, you know, that's something to monitor on an ongoing basis. Okay, so
and you know, like when it comes to that geopolitical stuff, like if there's no advantage to starting a war somewhere, because we're so entrenched. Like the U.S. dollar, Canadian dollar is tied to the U.S. dollar. If energy prices, you know, skyrocket because of a bomb in a bad place, you know, it makes no sense, because all of these countries are broke. Like they're flat dead broke. They've got they've got nothing to run on. So it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to be dropping bombs.
Yeah, even for the people in those countries, right? Like I think there's a lot of, I think people are controlled by fear. So the media can get people to tune in by fear, and politicians can get people to think that they're more important than they are through fear. So living under the threat of war is sometimes more useful for the powers that be than actually going to war, or, you know, especially a full-fledged significant escalation of a war, right? So that's, in my view, that's not that different in a lot of other countries too. You know, even if you're the leader of Iran, it's like you don't want your whole country bombed. Like that's not the positive outcome for you either. So
there's no win there. Like,
it's never, for that reason, it's never the likely outcome, right? It's always a potential. But tends to be, the potential is overstated, because people are easier to control when it's easier to get people to tune in if they're scared, right? So
exactly,
it tends to be a little overstated, but always a possibility. Okay, here's the main, like, ultimately, inflation is the money supply. You know, you've heard the saying, too many dollars chasing too few goods. Okay. You know, what is that? This is, you know, the Canada M2 money supply. And this is going all the way back since 1970, okay? And the reason why I focus on that is because that's when the U.S. dollar came off the gold standard. That really is, you know, where our financial system changed. Significant difference from, okay, you've got Bretton Woods in the 30s, but, you know, became a new world in 1971 when the U.S. was officially off the gold standard.
Nixon. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. So, and you can see, you can really see here, it's like, just look at the money in the system here, 2.55 trillion. But go back 50 years, it's like there wasn't even $100 billion in the system. Like, it's just a massive, massive growth in the money supply. It works out to a compound annual growth rate of 8.3% since we got off the gold standard.